Well, welcome everyone to this webinar. We wanted to give others a few minutes to log on. We had about 100 RSVPs for today, and so I imagine others will be joining as they are available. But my name is Lois Pace. I'm with the Global Health Council, and we're happy to host this webinar today. As many of you might know, we actually convened a series of webinars last year around the Global Financing Facility. That work has continued, and so we have been working with a number of people involved with the GFF on developing yet another series of webinars for this year. This is the first in that series. There will be another webinar we're hosting along with an in-person meeting April 21st, and then finally an additional webinar on the 1st of May. So we hope that you will stay with us throughout the series. As for today, we will be introducing more information on the consultation around the draft civil society engagement strategy, and so hopefully you all have received a copy of the draft strategy via email. We did circulate that to all those who had RSVP for today's webinar. If you don't have that handy, we have included a link to that strategy in the chat box, and so you should be able to find it there so you have it in front of you. But we'll have a number of speakers available to both present the strategy, both kind of how it came into being and specifics around some feedback that we have received already, in addition to answering some questions that you all might have. We can appreciate that sometimes it's a little bit easier to hear from authors directly about the process and any details, and then have your questions answered sort of real time so that they can hear from you helpful input that can further inform the process. So again, we thank you all for joining. Some logistics around how we hope this can go, as are all of our webinars. This one has everyone muted on the line to minimize disruption, but you should freely use the chat box function. And so you will see a chat box to your right on the screen, and you will be able to ask a question using that once we open it up for Q&A. Please do include your name and your organization as well as to whom you would like to direct your question, and then we'll get that answered accordingly. We most likely will read through a few questions at a time so that speakers can answer a group of questions at once. Finally, a couple of more details before I pass it on to our first speaker. This webinar is being recorded, and so it will be made available after we finish today. We also encourage you all to, if you so choose, tweet about some of this conversation via social media, and you'll see the tags included on the various title slides throughout the presentation. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce Betsy McCallan of the White Ribbon Alliance, who will offer a bit of background on the civil society strategy. Betsy?
Thanks, Lois, and welcome, everyone. I'm Betsy McCallan. I'm the CEO of the White Ribbon Alliance, and I also chair the NGO constituency of the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, and am a member of the Global CSO Coordinating Group. So want to say, first of all, thanks to the Global Health Council and PMNCH for organizing this webinar and the series that Lois mentioned. We hope these have been helpful to the broader community, and certainly, welcome feedback in terms of content and topics. So I wanted to just very briefly share a little bit of information about the impetus, really, for the development of this strategy. As the Global Financing Facility began, it very much has been an evolving process with quite a lot of learning and adaptation along the way, and that includes around the role of civil society. So civil society, there was recognition of the engagement of civil society, certainly as it related to governance, and as the governance structure of the investors group was established, that included designated seats for civil society, and we had interim members of the IG to start, and then an open process and nominations process for now the next representatives to the investors group. But aside from the governance structure, there wasn't necessarily a lot of guidance or clarity on the other roles for civil society in terms of how to engage civil society, why to engage civil society, and when. And therefore, there was a lot of mixed experiences from different countries as the GFF was getting going, as well as from broader global civil society who was trying to engage in the process. One of the things that the CSO groups worked with the GFF Secretariat on was really to reflect on some lessons learned. And there have actually been 2 sessions that were held, two country-level workshops to really look at lessons learned about how things have gone in the initial stages of developing the investment cases and moving forward with the global financing facility, particularly in the first wave countries. One of the pieces that came out of that first learning session was a set of minimum standards around CSO engagement as something that could also be used to discuss and feed guidance notes and other processes for the global financing facility. But it was also recognized that there was still to some extent some confusion again about the roles for civil society and how to best engage. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it's such a wide range of skills and expertise when you talk generically about civil society. That includes implementing, organizations who are really providing, in some cases, a tremendous amount of service delivery for reproductive, maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent health. You have other CSOs who have tremendous expertise in research and analysis, others who are providing technical assistance to country partners, other civil society organizations that play a critical role in linking communities and affected populations. Other civil society key role around advocacy, both in terms of priority areas as well as resource mobilization. And then, of course, the critical role that civil society plays in terms of independent accountability. So looking at this wide range of roles and different moments and processes in which civil society could be meaningfully engaged, ranging from the development of the investment cases themselves, as well as the supporting mobilization of resources during the implementation period, and again the accountability role. So this was some of the rationale for developing the civil society engagement strategy. This has been very welcomed by the GFF Secretariat, by the Investors Group, and the variety of partners that have been involved in GFF to date. The drafting of this document very much came out of the learning processes and workshops that I mentioned, and then further drafting has been done by the Global CSO Coordinating Group, which includes the members of the civil society members of the Investors Group. I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to Susanna Hurd, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we've heard during this open consultation period. We wanted to cast the net as wide as possible to get inputs from a broad range of civil society partners, as well as other key UN development partners, country government partners in this process, so that we will emerge with a civil society engagement strategy that all partners buy into and are clear on the respective roles and responsibilities and other actors' roles in also helping to further the strategy. The strategy is going to be a key agenda item for the upcoming Investors Group meeting in April. So this consultation period has been really critical, and I'll turn it over to Susanna to talk about what we've heard from many of you, and then we'll move on to take questions and talk about next steps. Thanks very much.
Great. This is Susanna Hurd. I am with Global Health Visions. I'm a consultant, and I've been supporting the Civil Society Coordinating Group in various capacities, but specifically in the development of this draft civil society engagement strategy, really throughout the process of gathering feedback and laying out what the strategy would look like from the Civil Society Coordinating Group and the Investors Group members, civil society members, and then throughout the process of consultation. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about some of the feedback that we've heard so far and a just high-level overview of the strategy itself. So just to quickly touch on the goal and objective of the strategy, the goal is that civil society is meaningfully engaged in the GFF from subnational to national to global levels, such that the full breadth of their skills and expertise can contribute to determining and achieving mutual goals and targets, including those laid out by the GFF and GFF countries, the Global Strategy for Women's, Children's, and Adolescents' Health, and the Sustainable Development Goals. The objective is that GFF stakeholders will agree and act upon a clear set of roles and responsibilities for enhancing civil society engagement in the GFF that contribute to improved GFF systems and processes at all levels, with particular focus on countries, including development, implementation, and accountability for GFF country investment cases and health financing strategies. Next slide. So Betsy talked a little bit about this already, but just to quickly summarize the strategy consultation process, there was a November civil society meeting in Dar es Salaam where this was sort of initially discussed. There's been a series of drafts and input from the Civil Society Coordinating Group. There's been input and discussion with the GFF Secretariat. As many of you are aware, there has been an open consultation period from February 14th to March 14th online, and various presentations and consultations with specific working groups, and then some targeted one-to-one outreach and input gathered from various investors group members. So the feedback that I'm going to highlight today is mostly kind of what was gathered through the online consultation period, but it also does reflect some of the larger themes that that folks from through other avenues have offered on the strategy. Next slide. So the first section I'm going to touch on is the section in the strategy called the unique value of civil society to RMNC-AH. This section really aims to provide sort of an overview of civil society and the key roles that civil society is well positioned to play in support of the GFF. And in order to facilitate greater engagement of civil society in GFF processes, it was really important, we felt it was important to make a strong case for civil society's engagement. And so we used this section to really outline the potential ways in which civil society can add value to the GFF. Some of the feedback that we heard was a need to better highlight how subnational and local civil society organizations will be supported and encouraged to have their voices heard, and a need to sort of differentiate the value add of different kinds of civil society, so small grassroots organizations versus larger ones. We heard that there should be a bit more about civil society organizations' role on the demand side, representing citizens, making sure donors, governments, etc. are accountable. We heard about the critical role that civil society organizations play and can play in sharing information with communities about their entitlements, their roles and obligations, and a real need to highlight how civil society organizations have this unique opportunity to engage with private sector donors and their role in promoting and catalyzing public-private partnerships. Next slide. So the next few slides cover a broad section, which is really the meat of the strategy, which is the roles and responsibilities section, which outlines the structures and processes for improving civil society engagement in the GFF that really will improve meaningful engagement, as well as the specific roles and responsibilities of civil society itself and other GFF stakeholders in implementing those structures and processes. It's not an exhaustive list of roles and responsibilities, as there is a recognition that each GFF country will have some of its own sort of say in decision-making around some additional, roles of civil society in GFF processes, but it's intended to really provide a kind of clear framework that, that everyone should be working off of. So starting with the roles and responsibilities for civil society, the feedback that we have heard first centers around a few kind of key questions. How specifically will civil society representatives of marginalized groups, smaller CSOs, and those representing underfunded issue areas be engaged if their participation is not a requirement? How specifically will civil society organizations, existing civil society organization coalitions be leveraged, particularly in places where there are numerous coalitions? Which ones would be selected? How will civil society organizations have access to the information they need to play their role in accountability? And several comments, in fact, around the need for funding to actually do that and really connect data to action. And then we've received a number of quite a bit of feedback around this issue that civil society selection and representation in these processes at global and country levels, that priority should really be given to those civil society organizations that represent coalitions in order to really be connecting, amplifying the voices of many CSOs, and that we need to be really clear about their role in sharing information and in consulting with the broader constituency as part of that role. Next slide. The roles and responsibilities section for country governments. The feedback we've received is that was related to a request for a clear statement around a minimum of 2 civil society organization members on country platforms. We will have a chance to kind of discuss some of these issues, but one of the things with the civil society strategy is that we needed to align with the guidance note that provides guidance on multi-stakeholder country platforms. And so some of these issues are issues that have been discussed as part of that guidance note development process. And just wanted to point out that that was a key sort of element of the process of developing this strategy in coordination with the GFF Secretariat, was making sure that there is that alignment so that there are not different sets of instructions for stakeholders. That we received some comments around needing more detail and specifics around transparency and communication requirements for country platforms and focal points. That there could be more on how specifically country governments will ensure participation of youth and marginalized groups, how all civil society organization voices will be heard. That really a request that country governments should recognize and support civil society's role in accountability, and a suggestion that country platforms should develop a stakeholder engagement plan for engaging civil society organizations outside the country platform. And actually that may be feedback that's relevant for other constituencies as well, as much of this is. Next slide. We're on roles and responsibilities for GFF partners. So this section sort of gets into other partners such as the Secretariat, the GFF Secretariat, and PMNCH. So the feedback we heard here was that a mechanism should be established by the Secretariat for reporting and remedying grievances related to the GFF process and implementation. We heard that the GFF Secretariat responsibilities should include and be very clear about knowledge sharing and access to information, including what's produced by country governments, and making sure as much of that information as possible is readily available in a timely manner on the GFF website. Suggestion that civil society should be a recurring item on every GFF country update at the Investors Group meeting, rather than just an annual agenda item. Next slide. So then we also asked stakeholders some other sort of broader questions to feed into the strategy. The first one being, what does civil society need to be successful in its roles and responsibilities that are outlined in the strategy? We heard over and over and over again that capacity building was a big one, and this includes for effective advocacy on behalf of their constituencies, for strong communication, for how to interface effectively with national leaders and global influencers, public financial management and budgeting, social accountability, and kind of management and business principles that are really key to their accountability role. Sustainable funding was also a big one for scaling up proven strategies and interventions, and also towards their role in oversight and accountability and in community and citizen engagement. There were requests for support for documenting and disseminating best practices or promising practices and lessons learned, for communication and information sharing, not only receiving regular updates from the GFF, but making sure, as I said before, that information is available online, and the critical piece of that if civil society is going to play this role in accountability, that they need information on what's happening at country level, and specifically also around the other roles that civil society can play. There's a need for information on what those government needs are. What are those gaps that civil society is well positioned to play, where they could step in and provide that support and that role. Support for youth engagement and effective representation of civil society by really speaking with one voice, and that's really critical for civil society to be taken seriously and to demonstrate and communicate our value add to the GFF. Next slide. There was a question around if there is a financing mechanism to support civil society engagement, where should that mechanism be housed? A number of folks, in fact most, suggested that it be within the GFF at the global level. We heard feedback that it could be housed within the WHO, connected with PMNCH. We heard feedback that it could be funded and managed by members of the Investors Group. And then some of the other feedback related to such a funding mechanism that we heard from really a number of folks were that there really should be a transparent process, either an annual call for proposal or another type of application process, that civil society really should be consulted in the development of the mechanism, that it should be transparent and accountable to ensure that the funding is being used to address the needs of civil society, and that funding must be available for smaller civil society organizations and those that represent marginalized groups and issues. Next slide. And then this question circles around what else is needed, what else needs to be included in the strategy to support civil society success, and what specific actions would you include? Some of the suggestions we heard were around mechanisms for rotating participation of civil society organization coalitions and memberships, monitoring and evaluation mechanisms for civil society organizations, some regional and national dialogues that include civil society organizations to really enhance and improve understanding of the GFF civil society engagement strategy and general GFF processes. That there is a real need for more clarity around how the GFF will work in fragile contexts, and that this is relevant to the civil society engagement strategy because of this question around how civil society will be engaged in fragile contexts. There was a request for an example, even if it's theoretical, of the best way for civil society to engage. I think there were still some questions around sort of specific entry points in the GFF process for civil society. There was a suggestion around having a civil society organization member embedded within the GFF Secretariat. And then lastly, there was a number of folks who requested that the key gaps and challenges in civil society engagement to date in the GFF that should be included in the strategy and sort of mapped against best practices or lessons learned, and how they will be addressed. There were some discussions early on in this process where the strategy itself was quite long, and we had included some of this information, around the gaps and challenges to date and key lessons learned from other initiatives. But some of that stuff is already has already been documented in other reports and papers, and so what we tried to do is to reference and footnote those throughout. But this is an interesting suggestion to consider, perhaps a table format or an annex that highlights some of those just top-level findings that might be helpful for the strategy to have kind of quickly available. So some great feedback. That's it that I'm going to summarize right now. Lots more information has been received, but just wanted to sort of touch on some of the highlights and some of the themes and feedback that was sort of commonly received. And so I'll stop there and I guess turn it back over to Lois.
To me, yes.
Great.
Thank you, Susanna, very much for that. And so I want to pause and give people an opportunity to type questions into the chat box. For those who didn't hear the announcement at the start of the webinar, we welcome you to insert your questions there. Be sure to include your name and your organization, as well as to whom you would like us to direct the question. I'll give it another minute or so for people to do that, and then we'll come back. Okay, well, we have at least one question, and it was with regards to capacity building, whether or not that's built into RFPs, I believe. I'm not sure if that's something, Susanna, you referenced as part of your presentation, if it's speaking to the funding mechanism perhaps or some other component, but specifically around capacity building, people have asked. I also want to take this opportunity to say I believe we have Angela Matunga on the line from Japaigo, and so she's available to answer questions as well. So Susanna or Angela?
Yes, I'm online. Do you mind repeating the question, please?
The question was around capacity building and whether or not those have been built into the RFPs.
Okay. Assuming I understand the context in which the question is being asked, focusing on the draft strategy, if every member in this call has read it, there is a section where we talk about gaps, and the hope after this particular strategy is approved is to follow with a detailed budget and action plan, where some of the suggestions around capacity building will then be addressed from a very specific and guided action perspective on what could be done. We could suggest very many things in terms of capacity building, but at this particular point we are keeping the strategy a bit broad, speaking to some of these issues, but we are hoping that immediately after its approval, then we are going now to put together a detailed action plan. But in terms of the strategy communicating to the GFF Secretariat of the need for capacity building at CSOs, that has been captured, and Suzanne can also look at it with just a few of us to make sure that it comes out as strongly as we are hearing it from the feedback that we've already received.
Thanks very much, Angela. We have a, sorry, did I cut someone off?
Lois, it's Betsy. I was just going to add to what Angela said, just to make sure that it's clear to all that there is not an existing funding mechanism or call or RFPs around this. So this is part of what, as Angela said, we are outlining in the strategy in terms of the need for that kind of support. But just to be clear, we are still very much at the strategy stage as Angela outlined.
Okay, great, Betsy. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that was an important clarification to make as well. And thank you again, Angela, for your response to that question. We have several more that have come in, and so I will ask them accordingly. There's another question about whether or not there's any structure of selecting CSOs, and if yes, how the GFF will work on that. I believe it's with regards to selecting CSOs to serve in formal capacities as advisors. And then there are a couple more that I will just go ahead and ask and leave it to you all to think about. There's a question about draft investment cases and whether or not they're publicly available, particularly for CSOs to engage in. And they're seeking, I guess, good practices at the country level that they can draw on. And then finally, another question on capacity building, really recognizing the need for capacity building, wanting to know how it's being addressed. I think that was somewhat answered in Angela's response, but I just wanted to share that additional question on capacity building as well. So there's that question on capacity building, there's a question around investment cases, and then there's another around selecting CSOs for engagement. Angela, would you like to start and then pass it on to others?
Great. So in terms of the structure for CSOs to engage, from Betsy's initial remarks, we did submit minimum standards that were looked into by the IG, and some of the recommendations have started being actioned. That is the process. That is how come we do now have 2 CSO representatives, myself and Amino, who were elected through a rigorous, lengthy process for all of us to at least have a representation at the highest governing body, and that is the Investors Group. The same minimum standards, again, seeks to address the CSO structure and representation at the country level by advocating for instance, CSOs to self-select themselves in terms of 2 or so representatives, depending on the context where the 16 countries are operating. And our CSOs are organized there, at least to have a minimum of 2 represented at the country top management platform. So those are some of the very concrete examples of how some of the lasting structural issues around CSOs engagement have been addressed thus far. But I guess we are open to more suggestions, from this particular webinar, and also on a continuing basis as we continue engaging with CSOs. Especially as we get the feedback of what's working, what's not working in various places, and how different contexts would wish to see their needs being voiced at the GFF secretariats and consequently to the IG.
Great. Does anyone want to take the other 2 questions?
It's Betsy. I can add briefly. So just building on what Angela shared in terms of the formal rules for CSO and the process with the investors group representatives that she outlined, which just concluded recently, and those are 2-year terms. And then there also is this CSO coordination group, and like most of the processes, as I mentioned, around the GFF have been evolving. This is also evolving, and we're in the process of working on updating and revising terms of reference around that group, which will likely end up looking something like a kind of steering group that hopefully that includes the IG members, hopefully focal points from GFF countries and global representatives in a kind of a steering group, but then also has basically an open kind of community of practice, if you will, in terms of CSOs interested in engaging, and that includes through listservs and webinars like this one and other ways to kind of share and coordinate action and information. I think the thing that's important, that's been a big part of the conversation also around the GFF, is the desire to not be creating new structures and new platforms. So I think this has been a little bit of the challenge, because particularly during the development of investment cases, there is a lot of interest in engaging in that way, and then the question is, well, then what does it look like? And there's been quite a lot of work and collaboration between the GFF Secretariat and the PMNCH, for example, to really look at how to strengthen multi-stakeholder country platforms for RMNCHA that are not, again, GFF-specific platforms. And so there's been some work going on now in terms of the development of guidance notes around that kind of engagement. So we're not, once again, kind of siloing efforts, but looking at that more broadly, because similarly the investment cases themselves are really investment cases across again, across the continuum, but it's not necessarily that the entire investment case is not being funded through the GFF. So that's an important piece to look at. So I think it's a bit of again, evolving in terms of how that moves forward, but that's something that is being looked at, how to overall strengthen these platforms, which in many countries exist between development partners, and the government, but may not have space for civil society, youth organizations, the health professional associations, for example, and so how to expand that, and also how to really ensure, as Angela outlined, that it's CSOs themselves that are organizing and selecting and running transparent processes, not that there's maybe a seat or two at the table for kind of hand picked NGO by the government, which may not be as representative of broader CSOs. And so those are some of the things that that are being looked at as well in terms of those overall platforms, and how do we support and strengthen CSO networks for that kind of coordination and engagement, so the very limited seats on these governing structures can be more representative, can be more consolidated. In terms of the question, I think one of the questions, and others can add to, in terms of the investment cases themselves and those documents, I mean, there is a real desire, and the GFF Secretariat's been working hard to try to make information available and transparent, but it is it's one of the challenges is between again, this sort of investment cases themselves and then what is actually being funded, and how to make that information accessible to civil society and other partners.
This is Susanna. Can I jump in as well?
Go ahead, Susanna.
Great. So just to add to that, you know, on the GFF website, there is a country page for each of the GFF countries. I think only 4 of them right now, but 4 of them do have links to the investment case or the project appraisal document, or in some countries that have opted to kind of build on a larger process, they might have a link available to a broader health transformation plan that is sort of serving as the investment case. So some of that information is available on the GFF website. I think the plan and kind of the push is to have that available for all countries, but it's just been a bit of a slow process, and is something I think that civil society continues to advocate and push for, because I think that in some countries that did take, the ones that are up there now, it took quite a while to get it up there, and obviously there's still a lot more information that needs to be widely shared. So that's something I think that civil society continues to advocate for. I also wanted to add that you know, I referenced earlier, and it's referenced several times throughout the strategy, that there is this guidance note for country platforms, multi-stakeholder country platforms, which will be publicly available when it's finalized, and that the civil society coordinating group and investors group members have been weighing in and providing input into the development of that country platform guidance note, which provides more recommendations around how those country platforms should be made up, including representatives from civil society. They are not, the guidance note is not extremely prescriptive. It doesn't say, you must have X number of civil society representatives on the country platform, because it's really intended to be country owned and driven, but there are sort of strong recommendations around and expectations, I think, laid out about participation from a range of different constituency groups, and that those should be representative and consulting with those larger constituency groups.
Yes, and I would like to add something.
Yes, please, Angela. I think Susanna spoke to another question we received too about the range of CSOs that would be able to be involved. So go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, I would like us to appreciate 3 or 4 facts at this particular point. So the kind of documents that we are referencing to, including this particular guidance note, will be able to pitch the big picture from everything that CSOs are streaming in as key concerns. So that is one point, because the document has to be short for the investors group consumption, and it needs to be more broad and a true guide. Now, the expectation is that, as Susanna has just said, for country ownership, for innovations and dynamism that is expected now to operationalize the approved documents, including the guidance note, that particular onus remains at the country level to unpack and to see through things depending on how the local context works, taking care not to introduce many other parallel and siloed programs, as Betsy has already alluded to. And then the last thing is to say that the investment cases, there's already a GFF website, and the country pages have posted the documents that are ready for the public consumption. But the key important thing for us to note as the civil society is that we are not likely to get the level of analysis that we need to see from both the investment cases and the project appraisal operational document, which in the countries that have started receiving money already operational priorities are mapped out. So to get to those type of minute analysis, then we will need to take advantage of this broad guidance, and then now within that, strengthen our team in terms of how we engage, how we take those documents and analyze them further for now the to-do action items of our CSOs in various places. I just wanted to make sure that we are very clear that the level of detail to that extent is not going to be realized, and I don't think that should be an expectation at this particular level for this, but to the extent that clarity, definitions, expansion on exactly what we mean by this, you know, to the extent that that can be done without then making the document a 500-page plus, you know, kind of a stuff is avoided at this stage.
That's fair, Angela. Thank you very much for that. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. There was one question specifically around the chain of communication. And so you have these countries or proposed country focal points, you have the representatives on the country platforms, you have representatives to the IG, you have this global CSO coordinating group. What exactly do you all foresee as how those various representatives communicate with each other, and can you provide a bit more detail around their distinct roles and added value?
Do you want me to take that one, Lois?
Yes, I'm happy to whoever. I was going to pitch it to Angela, but I can pitch it to whomever. Go ahead.
So I think this is a very important question, because part of the barrier, or one of the key barriers to civil society engagement in the GFF has been lack of information, or lack of access to timely information. And so we've been trying within the coordinating group to work around that. So communication is going to happen at different levels, and the Secretariat, this is the GFF Secretariat, has prioritized making sure that information is available as fast as possible to participants on the ground and at the global level. So insofar as the information from countries comes up, that is then shared on the country pages on the GFF website. As noted by Susanna, the investment cases and processes can only be shared on the website once they've been fully cleared by the governments, and we've seen the governments reticent to put draft documents on the webpage, so it remains a bit slow in terms of how people can get access to country-specific information at the global level. What we have tried to do, and this was in an exercise led by PAI last year, was to develop a guide for civil society that points them towards where and how to engage around the different the different stages of the GFF process, and so that can already be useful to civil society in finding out a bit about where they can find information and how they should engage in the GFF processes, particularly the planning process at the national level. Other things that the Civil Society Coordinating Group has tried to do at a global level are ensure the webinars that happen regularly that provide partners with the opportunity to comment on global level governance documents, so most of the things that get presented to the IG. The working group also puts out a bi-monthly newsletter that, in addition to highlighting all of the news that the GFF puts forward, also highlights things that are specifically related to civil society. So if there are any consultations, tools, meetings that are specifically related to civil society that people want to have access to, then they can find the relevant information in those newsletters. The coordinating group currently doesn't include systematic representation from the focal points for all of the different countries, but as mentioned by Susanna, that is one of the things that we are trying to work on, so ensuring that there is the latest information from all of the GFF countries from a civil society perspective that builds into all of the work that that coordinating group does. But as mentioned by some of the colleagues on the call, it is difficult to find out who those specific focal points are when the selection processes in country haven't been ideal. So that's still something that we're working on. So In terms of anyone needing information, there are various ports of entries. Once we do know the civil society focal points, the first port of information for any civil society organizations in countries would be the civil society focal points. In addition to that, we do have a public list of actual GFF Secretariat focal points for the different countries that could also provide the latest information on the planning processes in countries. And then from there, on anything that's general civil society related, the coordinating group and the civil society IG members provide the port of information that relates to global level governance.
Great, thanks. And I think this is actually a good time to go ahead and segue to Kadi Toure of the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health to wrap us up with next steps.
Thanks, Lois. And this is going to be relatively quick because it's been covered both by Susanna and Betsy. We were thankful to everyone for having sent in comments. This strategy has been through various iterations and has seen comments from IG members as well. So we hope that it will be finalized within the next week and a half and submitted as a background document to the IG meeting, debated and adopted hopefully at the IG meeting on the 24th of April. And when that happens, as Angela mentioned, we hope to have to start to develop a fleshed out work plan that will look at the short term and the medium/long term. As Betsy mentioned, a lot of the activities that are included or proposed activities that are included in the engagement strategy depend on some large scale financing from the GFF Trust Fund or the GFF Secretariat or somebody. So we will be in late April trying to flesh out what a work plan could look like, what can be done with existing resources, particularly that partners that are engaged in the CS coordinating group already have on hand, but then also flesh out a bigger proposal that could be submitted if we are able to get some additional resources from the GFF Secretariat or funders. So in the webinar that will take place, I believe, on the 1st of May, we should be able to feed back to this group about what the specific timelines are for the development of that work plan and to share whether the IG meeting has come up with any decision or recommendations as to resourcing civil society engagement.
Great, thank you, Kadi. Well, with that, I think we will go ahead and thank everyone for joining today. I hope that you've had your questions answered adequately, either via chat or just by listening in. I want to thank each of the speakers especially for partnering with us and taking the lead on this particular meeting. Again, we'll be reconvening on the 21st of April and finally on May 1st. And finally, the recording of this webinar will be available in the next few days. So should you have an easier time accessing that as opposed to a live broadcast, we welcome you to use that and also share it with others in your network. With that, have a wonderful rest of your week, and thank you again.